kinds of vision, right? You've got the why and the where. And so with the dorsal and the ventral stream distinction, it's not at all clear exactly what's going to be concerned with in Molyneux's question. And lastly, as I mentioned before, it just seems like we cannot test people recently healed of cataracts because their healing doesn't take place in an immediate fashion. And in fact, I mean, this doesn't come up in the book much, but I wrote a paper talking about a healing that Jesus does, where it takes him 2 healings of a person with blindness for them to fully see. So even, you know, the most like perfect situation where a miracle allows someone to see isn't immediate. Now, you know, of course, I'm not suggesting that that is anything more than a literary move in biblical text, but it still suggests or helps us conceive of the fact that we can't really test this experiment or this question, even though we would want to, right? So here's essentially the way that our book answers these questions. I think Les Goodman, who's an incredible scholar, definitively shows that Molyneux did not have access to Ibn Tufayle's kind of pseudo Molyneux question. And actually, our chapter 1 talks about Epicurus or Epicurean thought, Lucretius, etc., and whether or not Molyneux might have garnered his question from something that they ask, and that's discussed as well. Now, all of this red here suggests that, man, you know, Molyneux's question is in a bad place. All of these criticisms are legitimate. So why are we still talking about Molyneux's question? That's kind of what really concerns me. I don't really understand. And this kind of graph that's in the book, although it's black and white, but here it's in color. The red is just, you know, a no answer. The green is just a yes answer. And then the blue in the future are what are called pluralist responses. And we'll talk about the specificities of these answers in a moment. But it's surprising to me that, you know, there should be a decreasing interest in Molyneux given all of these criticisms. But it seems like it's just the opposite, right? We have an increasing interest in Molyneux's question as history goes along. And in fact, it might be because of these criticisms that there's so much interest in Molyneux's question. Here's a kind of more specific layout of kind of like the 50 most popular answers. You can see the dates, the answer, the person who gave the answer, and then why. The kind of general basis of why they gave their answer. Notice how in the 21st century, you just have this incredible surge of interest, not unlike the 18th century. If I could just move then to the kinds of answers, I think this is an interesting feature. A lot of philosophers try to manipulate the question because of its generality to specify the kind of answer that would be of interest to their kind of domain of inquiry. So if you're Leibniz, you're interested in commonsensibles, right? But if you're an empiricist or an experimentalist, you're interested in the cataract experiments. I can go back to this graph in the question and answer, but I'll just keep going here. So it does seem surprising that
chiudi la porta di là.
That there's just this many kind of this much diversity, as it were. And there's a lot of people who suggest. Wait, am I?
Stanno vedendo.
Are we good here? Oh, okay. This is someone's background mic. Sorry. So there's kind of a general consensus that there's more no answers than yes answers, and this has been used. I mean, I think even Gallagher in our volume makes this claim. But I guess if you just look at the diversity of answers, it seems like there's an even tie. So again, if you're Leibniz and you're interested in, shape concepts and their nature, you're going to be fundamentally interested in whether or not they're like mathematics or something like that, or geometrically based, and so you're going to be kind of focused on the commonsensible component. Whereas if you're an individual kind of interested in different experimental techniques in ways of acquiring a yes answer, you're going to try to simplify the stimuli as much as possible. We've got Van Cleve, who makes this really interesting experimental move. He says, just imagine a person when they're blind, knowing the difference between one dot and two dots, like Braille dots. If he were made to see, could he distinguish the one from the two? And I think, again, his intuition is yes. This could be, by the way, empirically verified, but notice how it's a way to kind of move towards an affirmative answer in a way that specifies the specific domain of inquiry of interest, namely mathematics, rather than wholesale like 3D geometry. Because we also have Diderot throwing in the 2D shapes because he's interested in more basic geometrical connections between the senses. So again, I think this helps answer the question is why Molyneux's question is still of interest today, and it's because I think there's so much diversity in answers, so much debate as to what would constitute a real answer, and then whether or not it's a yes or a no is an even tie, right? So we got to keep playing the game, as it were, in order to try to understand at a deeper level how to answer Molyneux's question and what the result of that answer would be like. So just some concluding thoughts. I do think, we asked about 50 different authors to write papers for this volume, and we were able to get 18, which is pretty good. But I wanted to get more individuals working in Chinese and Buddhist philosophy of perception. There's a few cases in history where they've actually talked about what do newly sighted people see, but it's usually with respect to very simple concepts like black and white, or like Van Cleve's numbers. But I think these are easy papers to write if you have this specialization in more global thinkers. I did want to talk about the ocularism that seems to be pre-existent in Molyneux's question, right? Again, the general idea here is that the person with blindness is not consulted as to what they think the answer might be until they're healed, right? Now, if you say, well, they're just the subject of the experiment, well, that's further dehumanizing, right? So this kind of culminates in this suggestion that people with blindness are disenfranchised by consulting the question and thinking about it. There's new work in disability studies that suggests that disabilities in general and blindness in particular is just a mere difference. It's just a different way of being, and that we should allow people to choose that way of being. It's not something to be cured. I guess I'm interested in what the kind of philosophical consequences are beyond the ethics of that. So would a person with blindness have completely distinctive intuitions about how to answer the question? Now, there is a really interesting, wonderful book from the 1930s by a person with blindness that focuses on Molyneux's question, and he inverts it, right? So he says, imagine a person who can see but can't touch. If they were made to touch, would they be able to identify the shapes by touch alone? And his answer is no. Touch is an incredibly complex thing that needs to be learned, a task, or the task of touch is too complex to be just given to you. You must learn how to do it carefully. And so, I think that's like a way to start down this path and in understanding people with disabilities and their intuitions about Molyneux's question. I think Gabriele might get into these last two, but I do think that whatever answer we have to Molyneux, it's not going to be yes or no. It's going to be yes according to a specific domain of inquiry, or no according to a specific field of interest. And that, if you can build up all these levels of explanation, all these domains of inquiry, yes for this one, no for that one, you could create a kind of global answer to the question that integrates all the yes and no according to their level of explanation into a complete answer for Molyneux. I think that integrative pluralist technique might be the way to answer the question. But again, that's a lot of work. Lastly, Bentz provides a really interesting paper where it seems like people with blindness have a kind of visual imagination that could allow them to answer Molyneux's question in a more interesting way. And I think that inclusion of these different senses beyond sight and touch, including the different species and their sensory organs. There's been Molyneux answers for bees, for birds, and well, I guess there's two different kinds of birds. I think a parrot and chickens, and they were all able to do it, right? Were they able to use their secret senses? I think that's an open question, and I think that deserves more inquiry from philosophers. There's been a lot of work on sensory substitution devices in Molyneux's question, but I think there's much more interesting technologies than that that could have a significant bite in how we go about answering Molyneux's question. Well, there's kind of my overview and my suggestion of new work, but I think Gabriele is going to do a great job talking about more specific issues with respect to neuroscience.
Okay, thanks a lot, Brian.
Thank you very much, Brian. Excuse me, Gabriele, I just need to say one more word, and that's we decided to record this meeting, but the platform here reminds me that by law we need to have the permission from everybody attending, including those just hearing, to the recording. So if anybody is objecting to being recorded, I'd like to ask to tell it now.
Well, I'll just wait for the end of my presentation and then I will decide, right?
So, quindi se qualcuno non è d'accordo al fatto che questo incontro sia presentato, dovreste dirmelo ora, perché per legge abbiamo bisogno del permesso di tutti. E quindi chiunque voglia esprimere un disaccordo lo faccia ora, per favore, se no procediamo con la registrazione. Okay, I suppose nobody objects. If some do, you still are welcome to tell it later, but now I give the floor to Gabriele.
Okay, thanks. Can you see the slide? Okay, great. So thanks, Brian, for the great introduction, the historical introduction. And now, so I like to focus on the second part of the book, which is more on the contemporary investigation of Molyneux's question. This is very interesting because, as Brian said, there's a lot of problems with not only answering the question, but still, preparing the ground in order to test what could be the situation we need in order to get a potential question. So, in general, in contemporary analytic philosophy of perception, especially of vision, philosophers are, more and more starving for experimental results in order to answer to philosophical questions. But also, usually, empirical results are not ready to be used. So first, you need to collect them. Then you need to offer a philosophical analysis of these experimental results, and then you can use them in order to answer your philosophical question. And that's precisely what's happening here with this kind of question. And it's really interesting because even though, as Brian said, we still don't know how to properly answer, it seems that there's a hierarchy of strategies which is really teaching us something more than what is the actual answer. That is, that vision is so complex, is a real complex phenomenon. We cannot explain what's vision without, you know, involving both philosophy of vision, neuroscience, ophthalmology, and so on. So from now on, I will try to review the literature which is trying to get an answer not only to Molyneux's question, but a more general answer to what is vision. Because, of course, in order to test or to answer Molyneux's question, you need to know what kind of process vision is. So the second part of the book is divided into two sections. Part 3 deals with the experimental results, and part 4 deals with the philosophical results. But things are interesting here because both sections host both philosophers and neuroscientists. And that's for a simple reason, because most of the time, you cannot get just empirical evidence, as I said, but you really need to understand what are the concepts you are using in order not only to interpret the empirical evidence you cash out from the experimental results, but also you need to decide the way in which you're going to test your subjects. So here's a sketch on the puzzle in between philosophy and neuroscience. First of all, the crucial question now is not what is the answer. It is a more pragmatic question. It is, how can we answer the question? So, of course, we have to turn to neuroscience and to different results in neurobiology. But then, as we turn to neuroscience, there are several constraints, crucial constraints, standing in the way of a possible response, complete response to the question. Constraint 1. So, first of all, of course, at the time of the experiment, your vision has to be successfully restored. Because, come on, if your vision is not working, how can you test it? And as we shall see, this is not a trivial claim. The fact that you need your visual system to be perfectly restored. And indeed, I mean, if your vision happens to be not restored, you might obtain, in testing, you might obtain a negative answer due to bad visual restoration. That is, it is not that Molyneux subject cannot recognize the shapes, it is just that he cannot see them. Second constraint, even important, the test should be performed immediately after the surgery, and ideally after the removal of any bandage after, you know, the surgery. And that's because you don't want to get any acquisition of experience, because the more is the perceptual learning the subject gets, the more you risk that the subject has, so to speak, learned how to use her eyes, and so to, you know, to calibrate saccadic movements, to you know, to focus on different aspects of the visual scene, and so to calibrate those things with touch. And constraint 3, which is like an appendix to number 2, restoration should be fast for the same reason. Because, I mean, if you give a lot of time for restoration, then you're going to have a lot of problems in distinguishing between what really is restoration at the neurophysiological level and what really is perceptual learning. But of course, as you may imagine, there's a lot of problems in this practice. This has been, you know, noted like, oh, wow, it's 20 years ago. If you get a review of all the experimental results from ophthalmology, neurobiology, neuroscience, you get that visual restoration is never immediate, but slow. And in most of the cases, it cannot be complete, even after a long time. And moreover, there's a critical period of recovery in which, when you have the subject, you know, with a proper functioning visual system, you cannot really know if the amount of the residual optical problems are due to the traumas reported, or as effects of course, the surgery, or if they are effects of perceptual learning. That is, you cannot really have a balance between the lack of vision due to improper perceptual learning and the lack of vision due to physiological problems. And it seems that it's quite impossible to have vision completely restored and suddenly restored. So there's a lot of problems concerning, color perception, shape perception, motion perception, and other kinds of other functions, other visual functions. And then if you take a look at this study, you have that there's a lot of, experimental problems standing in the way of obtaining the proper experimental scenario in order to test, not to answer, but just to test Molyneux conundrum. So there has been a crucial study, or it was supposed to be a crucial study, from the MIT, and it has been published in Nature Neuroscience by Held and colleagues. And Held and colleagues just, thought of having found a solution to the problem. They tested congenitally blind subjects having cataracts, and then it seems that in their experimental paradigm, it's a very easy paradigm. We can just focus on it like on the Q&A, but it seems that the answer was a negative one, because apparently if there are newly sighted subjects just touching Lego blocks and then having vision restored and then taking a look at Lego blocks, the same Lego blocks, they cannot have cross-modal associations between the blocks they have touched and the blocks they seem to see. There's been a very strong critic 2 years later by a philosopher, John Schwenkler, in a philosophical journal. And this is, I think, maybe Brian would agree, this is the start of the most interesting relationship between philosophy and neuroscience, while not only analyzing Molyneux' question, but also investigating what is the nature of visual processing. And Schwenkler just reviews a lot of problems from both the conceptual and the experimental view on the fact that, first, the test was not designed in a proper way, and the notion of vision used was not appropriate to the test, and so on. And there's been another very interesting test in newly sighted child, and in which Chen and colleagues just measured the timing of visual restoration after cataract removal. But even here, there's been a lot of problems because perceptual learning was allowed, and the test was not recording the specific timing of different specific processes like, shape processing or sights processing or gestalt processing and so on. So I myself, I tried to review recently in 2017 all these experiments in order to see what's at stake with the question. And it seems that there's really a lot of problems also in reasoning about a possible test, not only in just generating the test. And that's for some simple reasons that we need to take into account. First of all, there are two different kinds of blindness. You can be ocular blind, that is, your eyes are not functioning well, or your ocular processing, that is, the behavior of your eyes is not functioning well. But you can also be cortically blind, that is, you have problems in your visual cortex. Of course, even if your eyes are functioning, take the case of cataract subjects, it is not, this does not entail that your cortical visual processing restored. And that's for a simple reason, because your visual cortex needs to be trained to see. So even though your eyes will work, still you need a specific, very specific and peculiar visual training. Plus, and this is very important, there are two main interpretations of the question. So one thing is to ask whether the subject will be able to visually perceive the object's shapes placed before her eyes. Another thing, which is really different, is to ask whether, assuming that the subject is able to visually perceive the shapes, then she can also be able to recognize and distinguish them as a sphere and as a cube. That is, we can, in principle, distinguish between two different interpretations. One weak interpretation is, will the patient be able to visually distinguish the objects as such? And this seems to be really about the first component of the question. It is about the possibility of restoration. So it is more a biological question, not really a philosophical question. It requires to be tested. But then here's the interesting question. What if the Molyneux patient could see the shapes in question? So assume that vision is sufficiently, immediately, and completely restored. Could the subject at that point recognize the cube and the sphere? And this is, of course, the question we want to investigate in this book. But in order to investigate this strong interpretation, you first need to recollect empirical evidence which shows an answer, a positive answer to the weak question. So you need the subject, you need a subject that can see, and then you can test him. Now, there's also another distinction here because the question is about recognition, not just vision. And recognition is a sort of split process. One, you see the object, and two, you associate your memory stored information, your semantic, conceptual, theoretical knowledge to the visual percept. Then the question is whether, in case the subject can effectively see, whether she will also be able to recognize the cube and the sphere. But there's also another question here, because the original question is about recognition, the way the subject can have a visual experience of the external environment, and now she can effectively recognize the shapes. But then most of vision is involved in action guidance. So if you want to appropriately test Molyneux question, you need to take into account action. That is, you might want to understand whether and how it is possible for newly sighted not only to recognize the shape, but also to grasp the shape. And this is very interesting because our best theory of visual processing has suggested that mammals and other primates have a sort of bimodal brain, I would say, in which, or if you prefer, a brain with two different kinds of visual processing. One processing is involved in the action guidance, and the other one is involved in object recognition. But if so, it seems that you can split the question, Molyneux question per se, into two different questions, right? One is about recognition and one is about action. And of course, the more we get knowledge from neuroscience about the cooperation between the streams, the more we understand and we learn that the possible response to Molyneux question, but also the possible way of framing the test is so much complex that involves at the same time both philosophical speculation and also experimental results. So the new story we propose in the second part of the book, which is the one dealing with philosophy and neuroscience, is the following. Part 3, as I said at the beginning, it is about the experimental results. So we have 3 different news stories about Molyneux question and empirical studies. First of all, Brogard and colleagues suggest that the problem is not with testing per se, but it is more about the way you need a correct, as they call it, semantics of seeing, a theory of seeing which can explain what is vision and then which can allow you to properly test vision so specified with newly sighted subjects. Then we have a contribution by a neuroscientist, Ocelli. And this is a great review about whether and how and to what extent you can really restore vision in blind subjects. And then we have also a review on the possible answers we get, yes and no answers, on the basis of the philosophical explanations we embrace with respect to the experimental results we decide to follow. And there's also a special part in chapter 14 on the relation between action and vision, because it turns out that vision is a really pragmatic process. And so you cannot get rid of action and motor processing when investigating vision. So if Molyneux's question per se is about vision, and if vision and action are deeply related, then you need to take into account how action shapes vision. And then the philosophical contribution. So first of all, as Brian said, vision is a very complex phenomenon. And then there's a part of vision that really is imagination or imagery. So in answering the question, or even in reflecting about the possible experimental setting, we might want to invoke the role of imagination with respect to vision. Then chapter 16 by Pepa Toribio. So this is a chapter in which it is investigated the relation between the different levels of perceptual judgments. You have a level of mere like seeing, and then you have perceptual categorization, and then you have perceptual judgment, and then you have belief, and then you have cognition. And so all these layers must be taken into account when you want to give a proper answer to the recognition question on Molyneux. And then I myself try to model the question and action, which is, as the title says, on action at first sight, by suggesting that more and more notions of vision for action can help us to understand what's the best answer of the question on action processing, on Molyneux action processing. And then to conclude, there are three very interesting chapters. One is about the way we can answer Molyneux' question if we take into account experimental evidence, the philosophical interpretation of experimental evidence on somatosensory spaces, on bimodal phenomena, and so on. And then there's a very interesting chapter. I should not be the one describing this because it is by Brian, but it is about a very interesting relation, the one between Molyneux subjects and LSD. That is between pure visual experience on the one end, and the possibility of having visual hallucinations by using this specific drug, and so to have a visual experience of cubes and spheres. And finally, this is the last chapter, closing the book, and this is very interesting because it is a sort of review about not only what is Molyneux' question really about, but also concerning the different ways in which you can cash out Molyneux' question and its answer on the basis of the stimuli you're using, whether two-dimensional or three-dimensional stimuli, whether black and white or color stimuli. And so there are as many formulations, as many stimuli you can offer to your patients. And of course, being it the philosophical section of the book, there's a lot of speculation on what vision might be in all of these cases, and on which theory of vision we should endorse. And for the moment, that's it. I think it's enough to open the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Gabriele. Very clear presentation too. Now, before the Q&A, we of course have the comments and discussion by our discussants. So I think it may be the turn for Professor Parigi to give her comments. Silvia, if you like, please.
Okay, here I am. First of all, I have no presentation. I will only speak. And first of all, I would like, let me warmly thank Mario Alai for inviting me in this discussion, in this presentation. Molyneux's question is a very interesting topic for the historians of ideas, particularly for the historians of visual perception, among whom I hope to be included. Therefore, I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to discuss this forthcoming book, which is a collection of essays in history of philosophy. The book consists of 4 parts, as has been already said. These 4 parts are titled Historical, Ethical, Empirical, and Philosophical Advances in Molyneux's question, where I think that the key word is advances. Therefore, the preliminary question I would like to ask is the most general, a sort of universal question. What is it like to study history? What is history of philosophy? How should it be conceived in order to make it a meaningful enterprise? Is it a directional enterprise, moving from the worst to the best? The conception according to which history is a continuous, necessary advance is a kind of metaphysics or philosophy of history named historicism. So let us examine the editor's and the author's positions as it emerges, especially from the first part, that is to say, historical advances in Molyneux's question. Well, the research hypothesis seems to be as follows. The 18th century Western thought, 18th, not 17th, in that Molyneux's question was published by Locke as late as 1694, and is the main theoretical question of the 18th century. So, 18th century Western thought, that is to say, Molyneux, Locke, Leibniz, Condillac, Voltaire, Lametrie, Buffon, Diderot, Berkeley, who wrote seminal pages and entire works about Molyneux's question. This tradition, this 18th century Western thought, has to be neglected in favor of the, I'm quoting, marginalized voices in the history of early modern philosophy. Such marginalized voices are, I'm quoting, first, the ancient, medieval, and African philosophical answers to Molyneux's question, which nevertheless, I think, do not exist properly, because there was nothing similar to Molyneux's question in ancient and medieval times, as well as in the still largely unknown African philosophy. The second kind of marginalized voices are the influential ideas of women, even though they never dealt with Molyneux's question. The third kind of marginalized voices are, in the end, the voices of people with disabilities. Just a very few people, such as Pierre Villy, a blind scholar and man of letters, French scholar and man of letters, who published Le Monde des Aveugles in 1914. Perhaps he's the only blind man who wrote about blindness and the world of a blind man, Le Monde des Aveugles. He wrote a trilogy about the psychology, pedagogy, and sociology of blind people. These 3 books were published between 1914 and 1927. Incidentally, Villy says he would have given the affirmative answer to Molyneux's question, though not at first sight, as Locke had claimed. So the history of philosophy inspiring the first part of this book is counterfactual history of philosophy. That is to say, the essays are dealing with some authors, more or less known, who did never write about Molyneux's question, but might have written. For example, what Amo, the first African man to study in a European university at the beginning of the 18th century, as well as Lucretius, Damaris Cadworth, Lady Masham, or even the great Spinoza, might have thought about Molyneux's question, what such philosophers might have thought about Molyneux's question, how they might have answered that question. I have many doubts about this kind of counterfactual history. I don't believe it may be useful, really, because it can't overcome a major objection. Whoever might have thought everything about Molyneux's question, why not Hegel or Schopenhauer or Plotinus? It has been said that this kind of fictional historiography focused not on what really happened, it has What is History, published in London in 1964. And this expression, historiographical, this kind of fictional historiography as a parlor game, this expression was quoted by Chris Mines in his essay on Amo. There may be other objections as to the single authors. Let us take into consideration the most famous one, Baruch Spinoza. In his philosophy, extension is an attribute of the unique substance that is God. His gnoseology is properly a metaphysics. Ideas, as well as bodies, are finite modes of the infinite attributes of extension and thought. The causes of these ideas are not bodies, but directly God. This is the meaning of parallelism between ideas and things, summarized in the very well-known sentence, ordo et connectio rerum, idem est ac ordo et connectio idearum. That is to say, the order and connection between things is the same as the order and connection among ideas. Human mind is not a substance, not even an individual conscience, but, I'm quoting, a portion of universal thought endued with individuality. That is to say, human mind is God, and each of its ideas is God. Therefore, Molyneux's question would be nonsense. In fact, Schneider, who is the author of the Spinozistic essay in the volume, concludes that the answer which Spinoza might have given is, maybe, it depends on the person. This seems to be the summary of the whole book, and this is also the conclusion reached by Diderot in 1749 in his Lettres sur les aveugles à l'usage de ceux qui voient, which is a book explicitly dedicated to Molyneux's question. Moreover, I don't think that history of philosophy may be usefully connoted by a gender. When we shift to female counterfactual history, things do not change. Why should we be surprised if Damaris Masham didn't write a word about Molyneux's question in spite of, I'm quoting, Locke's continued presence in her home? Why didn't Masham discuss Molyneux's question in her writings? Why was she only interested in religion and moral? In my opinion, those questions are unanswerable and therefore sterile, because she was interested in what she was, because she liked such topics and not others. In fact, she didn't write a treatise on sensation, and explains why in a letter to Locke written on April 1688, where she wrote, because she thinks that such questions are not useful for her life and the lives of others, this is her words, in that they have no import for practical and moral ends. Moreover, she had weak eyes, a kind of blindness. Therefore, she is supposed to be embarrassed in publicly talking about her deficit. The conclusion, not astonishing, is that, I'm quoting, there is not enough evidence to support both a negative and a positive answer to Molyneux's question in Masham's works. And the other conclusion is that Masham's philosophy is a, I'm quoting, unique blend of Lockean empiricism and Platonic rationalism. This is not astonishing as well, because she was Ralph Cadworth's daughter and John Locke's friend. There is another category commonly used in the essays collected in the first part, the historical part of this book. Molyneux's anticipations, a very dangerous category in history of science, I think, as that of forerunners. For example, Mozi, a Chinese thinker, lived in the 5th century before Christ. Epicurus, the author of an ancient version of empiricism, but we have only 3 letters and some fragments, and there is nothing which might be referred to Molyneux's question in Epicurus' works, I think. Some verses by Lucretius, but there are many doubts that Lucretius has been Molyneux's source of inspiration. Finally, Ibn Tufail, an Arabic physician who lived in the Islamic Spain in the 12th century. But unfortunately, I'm quoting, there is no indication that Molyneux read Ibn Tufail. I mean, whereas comparisons between ancient theories of knowledge, such as Epicurus and Lucretius, may be useful and stimulating, the search for forerunners appears useless and sterile. In fact, the Lucretius passage quoted in Scala's essay does not resemble Molyneux's question in that the man who walks in the dark, trying to recognize objects, is not and has never been blind. There are only 2 essays dealing with 18th century authors in this first part of the book. One is about Wilhelm Amo, who did not deal with Molyneux's question, as I have already said. The other about 18th century Irish debates, which did not concern Molyneux's question, as the authors themselves acknowledge, focusing on the nature of the attributes of God. In short, I totally agree with Julia Scalas, when the author of the essay about Epicurus, when she says, I'm quoting, "The problem of Molyneux is and remains a modern problem which finds its sources in the philosophical and scientific context of the time in which it was born." Let us examine the second part of this book, collecting 2 essays. Here the question is, why blind people have not been asked about Molyneux's question? And the answer is, someone, for example, Diderot, who wrote a work explicitly dedicated to Molyneux's question, spoke about blind people. For example, Nicholas Saunderson, who was an historical, not female character. He lived between 1682 and 1739, held the Lucasian chair of mathematics in Cambridge, and was a member of the Royal Society since 1719. He was a blind man who taught mathematics to seeing persons, and he was very successful in his teaching. Therefore, this may be considered as a direct testimony. But we discover that Diderot, in his, I'm quoting, infamous letter, Lettre sur Elisabeth, was guilty of discrimination and condemnation towards Nicholas Saunderson, because Nicholas Saunderson, whom he would have considered as an immoral person, that he was an atheist. Well, whoever has read Diderot's work has to note how impressive Saunderson's figure is. He's a really dramatic character, an absolute giant, who denounces the deep injustice he suffered in not seeing the wonders of nature. When he cries out against God because he can't believe in him, Diderot is completely empathetic with Saunderson. Diderot agrees with him. When Saunderson claims, and I would like to read the passage in French and then translating them into English. So when Saunderson claims Voyez-moi bien, Monsieur Holmes. Holmes is the priest. Je n'ai point Dieu. Qu'avions-nous fait à Dieu, vous et moi? Un pour avoir cet organe, l'autre pour un être privé. That is to say, look at me, Mr. Holmes. I have no eyes. What have we done to God, given that you have that organ, while I have not? When Saunderson utters these words, everybody cries in the room where Saunderson was dying. We may say, without any doubt, that Saunderson exposes Diderot's own philosophy, and his last words while dying are, "O Dieu de Clarke et de Newton, prenne pitié de moi. O God of Newton and Clarke, have mercy on me." Saunderson is a man without any fault, in Diderot's opinion, and Diderot is obviously not guilty of having any bias towards blind people as well. But why are blind people so rarely asked about Molyneux's question? I think not because of a moral prejudice, according to which they would be supposed to be bad persons, but simply because unless they had recovered sight, they can't answer. This is not a radical ocularist argument, where ocularism is defined as a socio-historical bias against people with blindness. This is only Molyneux's question, actually. Part 3, in the third part of the volume, deals with what neuroscience can tell us about visual gain and related empirical and conceptual problems. The conclusion reached here is that there is not, and there cannot be, any conclusion about Molyneux's question. It depends on the blind person, which is exactly Diderot's conclusion in 1749. Molyneux's question is I'm quoting, a conundrum whose resolution relies on empirical tests. Therefore, there are no empirical advances. In fact, the final diagram of the contemporary answers to Molyneux's question is not significantly different from the scheme summarizing 18th century answers. By the way, I appreciated Degener's experiments with Dutch teenage students, which parallel the outcomes of academic scholarship and keenly highlight the conceptual constraints posed by 18th century philosophers. I wonder why this very interesting essay has been put in the historical and not in the empirical section of the book. Coming to the last part of the volume, we find the same conclusion. I'm quoting, "A balance in the number of yes and no answers to Molyneux's question over 3 centuries of debate suggests that the problem remains unanswered to the satisfaction of philosophers." According to the authors, Molyneux's question is ambiguous. It is an ill-posed question from the point of view of neuroscience. It lacks specificity and is too general to be answered. It is a naive, coarse-grained question. Therefore, it would be necessary to transform it into a set of fine-grained sub-questions which could be pertinent to today's discipline-specific methodology. But after 370 pages of historical, ethical, empirical, and philosophical analysis, after dividing Molyneux's question in a set of sub-processes, a plurality of more specific sub-problems, the state of the question seems to be the same. In order to prove this statement, I try to summarize the conclusions of this book. The first one, it is biologically impossible to create a Molyneux subject. That is to say, no blind man can completely and immediately recover sight because of the impairment both of his eyes and brain. Moreover, the visual damage and lack of development in the cortical areas of vision after the critical period is different in each subject. On the one hand, I'm quoting, we effectively lack concrete criteria of what visual restorations really means. On the other hand, I'm quoting, cortical visual processing requires development over time. Therefore, there are an ocular and a cortical blindness, none of which may be completely restored. Second conclusion, Molyneux's question is both, I'm quoting, both the nightmare and the bench test of research in vision science and philosophy of vision. Cassirer wrote these same words as to the 18th century debate. Third conclusion, Molyneux's question should be reformulated perhaps in terms of action. That is to say, the experimenter should ask the blind person who recovered sight to bring him, for example, an apple, the fruit, or an iPhone. But I can't understand why and how this new formulation should help us in finding correct or unambiguous answers. In fact, the editors admit that this action paradigm for testing Molyneux's question has yet to be realized in the laboratory. Fourth conclusion, anyway, recognition cannot happen at first sight, as Locke wanted, because the temporal immediacy is not achievable experimentally. And finally, the fifth conclusion, the experimental situation we are looking for is not possible because of some biological and conceptual constraints, that is to say, ocular and cortical blindness, the critical period, after which the visual cortex cannot recover because of lack of environmental training. But also questions like, is the motion of the perceiver and the perceived object allowed? These are conceptual constraints to a solution of the problem. Let's have a look at the 18th century biological and conceptual constraints, that is to say, the necessary conditions in order to realize experiments that could test Molyneux's question, listed by some neglected Western philosophers. First, recognition cannot happen at first sight because both lack of training and ocular impairment. Who said this? Who posed these constraints, this condition? Berkeley, Voltaire, Condillac nell'essai sur l'origine des connaissances humaines, and Diderot. They said that no recognition can happen at first sight. As to ocular impairment, we have Lamétrie in Histoire naturelle de l'âme and Buffon in Histoire naturelle de l'homme, who speak about ocular impairment, which is how may I say, a biological constraint. Second, the blind person must know the names of the solid bodies in front of him. This is a condition posed by Leibniz in Nouveau essai sur l'entendement humain and Lamétrie, Histoire naturelle de l'âme. Another conceptual constraint posed by Diderot, not solid bodies, but plain bidimensional figures should be used. The fourth constraint, a conceptual constraint, very strong constraint posed by Diderot in his letter, both the experimenter and the blind should have a philosophical training. As is evident from the 18th century up to now, the answers to Molyneux's question are not neatly divided between rationalists, such as Leibniz, who give the positive answers, and empiricists, such as Molyneux, Locke, and Berkeley, who give the negative answer. That is to say, Molyneux's question cannot be a bench test between empiricism and rationalism. Diderot's letter is an exemplary case. In fact, in the diagram at page 27 of the book, Diderot is supposed to have given both the negative and the positive answer. I'm quoting, since every newly cited subject is different, every answer to the question is individual. This is exactly Diderot's position. It has been confirmed, incidentally, by many cases of blind people who recovered sight, starting from Cheselden's case in 1728 in London, up to these last years. In conclusion, I think that the actual conception of vision science, which is a mix of optics, physiology of the eye and brain, and psychology, goes back to Alhazen in the 11th century as Perspectiva Communis. Alhazen is the founder of perspective, and that Berkeley's definition given in the theory of vision vindicated in 1733 is still valid. He wrote, I'm quoting, "To explain how the mind or soul of man simply sees is one thing and belongs to philosophy. To consider particles as moving in certain lines, rays of light as refracted or reflected, or crossing or including angles, is quite another thing and appertains to geometry. To account for the sense of vision by the mechanism of the eye is a third thing, which pertains to anatomy and experiments." Section 43. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Parisi. This was wonderful. And now it's the last turn for Professor Vincenzo Fano.
Hi to everyone. I am here. Now I attempt to share my il tuo schermo intero. Is it possible to see my slides now?
Not yet.
Possible to...
No.
Not yet. Ah, strange. What happened?
Have you opened the PowerPoint before sharing? Just put the presentation mode.
Okay, one moment.
Yeah.
Now?
Yes, perfect. Now, just if you put the presentation mode is going to be, yeah, great.
Okay. Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you for this different contribution until now. That was very, very interesting. Thank you to Mario for organizing this very interesting meeting on a so amusing question like Molyneux question. I will say two things in my brief contribution. The first one is an attempt to answer to a historical question that was touched also a bit today by Brian. That is why it is the Molyneux question. Molyneux question has been so interesting for philosophers of 18 last part of 70 and above all 18th century. Why so many big philosophers, big minds, as also Silvia presented just now, have attempted to give an answer to this question, why it was so fashion, and now this question is again at the center of attention also in this very beautiful book. The first point is this one. It is an historical attempt to say something moving from building on what I learned reading the book. The second question is a very simple move, that epistemological move that I propose as a consequence of what I learned in the book about Molyneux questions. That is substantially that there are a lot of different Molyneux questions. I proposed a sort of classification, and each MQ question has another name, that is Ferretti MQ question, Glenney MQ question, and so on and so on. So one important result of this book it seems to me that there is not one Molyneux question. The original standard Molyneux question is one question, but philosophy, not empirical studies, but philosophy, that is conceptual analysis, has produced a lot of different questions, thinking about what does mean to attempt an answer to Molyneux question. This is the second point. Okay, but I cannot. There are not a lot of time, so I cannot say all what I want to say. But I make a very very rapid passing on the different questions. Okay, this is a famous excerpt from Locke second edition of the Essays, in which Locke presents the question. Here it is important to emphasize. I don't know if it is possible to see my mouse.
Yes, you can see.
Okay, here it is. The only point I would like to emphasize is a very important passage when Locke says, and this is also in the Molyneux original version, before touching them. This is the fundamental condition. No? There is no other important condition about Molyneux problem. Molyneux problem, the most important condition, the condition that is central for both Molyneux and Locke is that you cannot, the recovered blind cannot touch the cube and the globe. And so it is possible to imagine a lot of different experiments, how we will see in a moment. In each one of these, it does not happen that people touch the cube and the globe, but make a lot of different things that are possible that without violating this prohibition. Okay, this is the presentation. Okay, now I make a step backward to Aristotle, theory of perception. That is very important to understand what happened in the scientific revolution. According to Aristotle, the anima, we have a direct perception of colors, flavors, sounds, and so on, in which there is a sort of passing of the form from the stimulus. Stimulus is a modern language, but I think that here one can use this term without violating Aristotle's thinking, to our mind. The form passed directly from the stimulus to our mind. On the contrary, in what Aristotle speaks, what Aristotle says about common sense, there are not a lot of stuff on common sense in the anima, but it is very important. Common sense is not first for us, it's something that arrives after. It is something partly built on the basis of direct perception. And Aristotle is not completely explicit on this point, but common sensible are clearly less reliable from an epistemological point of view than the content of special senses. This is the general framework in which Aristotle posed the question of perception and the reliability of perception. This position is completely reversed by Saggiatore, one of the most important work in modern philosophy, where the discussion is about a comet, like happened a lot of time in the 17th century. Here we are 70 years before Locke and Molyneux. But here we have a completely different theory of perception. And Galileo is moved in his theory of perception not only from empirical motivation, but also with a priori motivation. He proposed a strongly rationalistic point of view in which he says that we have here perhaps it's better to see directly the word of Galileo in Saggiatore. Now he says that whenever I conceive any material or corporeal substance, I immediately feel the need to think of as bounded and as having this ordered shape, as being large or small in relation to other things, and in some specific place at any given time. That is primary, what Locke will call primary qualities. For Galilei are there is a sort of rational ground in thinking that this part that is common sensible in Aristotle's words is more objective than what is the content that is flower, sweet, noisy, silent, big. You see here in the second part of the quotation. Here all is in the reverse with respect to Aristotle. That is qualities, secondary qualities are not objective, primary qualities are objective, and there is a rational, I immediately feel the need. There is a sort of a priori need by Galileo to give to accept what common sense says and not what special sense says to him. So the situation is completely different. Here we have a what we dub with the modern term, a representationalist theory perception. That is, we are no longer in contact with the stimulus, but the stimulus causes in us a representation. And this representation is an attempt to catch what, how is done, how is it constituted, the stimulus, but what the objective part of the representation is the common sense and not the quality, the sweet, the color, the sound, and so on. So with Galileo, situation is completely different and with respect to what happened in Aristotle. What happened with Locke says concerning my understanding? Why it is important? Because the quotation of Molyneux arrives in the essays not a lot of time after Locke spoke about primary and secondary qualities. And I will emphasize a point, very important point in the presentation by Locke of this question, and in my opinion, this quotation by Locke, not this one, but in a moment you will see the quotation, is very important to understand why this Molyneux question has been so important for philosophy in the 18th century, and perhaps also why it is so important also for us. Not only an empirical or philosophical question regarding what happened to blind people, but a central point, a very fundamental question of epistemology and philosophy of science. Okay, we know that Locke distinguished between primary qualities. It is a very old language of scholastic primary qualities and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are real properties of body. Secondary qualities are not real, are only ways in which bodies favor in us the presence of colors, flavors, sounds, and other ideas that are not real. We have no reason to think that they are real. So here the presentation is very similar to what Galilei said 70 years before. The difference is that the Locke argumentation favoring this point of view is empirical, because Locke is an empiricist philosopher, and here we have the quotation from Locke. Qualities of this kind are the ones that the body doesn't lose, primary qualities, however much it alters, whatever force is used on it, however finally it is divided. You see that here Locke is favoring the objectivity of what Aristotle called common sensible on the basis of an a posteriori argument. This is very different to what happens in Galileo. And here you have a theory or a general theory of common sensible, a special sensible, similar to the Galileo one. But the approach is very similar to the Aristotelian one, in the sense that Galileo attempts to justify the objectivity of primary quality on the basis of an a priori argument. On the contrary, Locke justified this on the basis of empirical point of view. In my opinion, the position of Locke is a step forward with respect to Galileo. Galileo is very confused on this point. Okay. After this is not a lot of before Molyneux question, and not a lot of lines before the introduction of Molyneux question. We have this quotation in the essays. The point is that the point of Locke here is that with experience we modify deeply our perception, and this modification is very important, so that, and this is the last point, the red part of the quotation, and so our judgment acquires a habit of immediately altering the appearances into their causes. That is, this is the point, important point, perception accustom us to perceive the common sense, what is objective and not what is subjective, that is quality, secondary qualities. And this happens in an automatic, this is very similar to what Helmholtz in 19th century will call the subconscious inference. In Locke, there is a sort of subconscious inference that we acquire with experience. And Molyneux problem, and the negative answer to Molyneux problem by Locke, is exactly the proof of the presence of this subconscious inference from what appears to us to what causes, what is the objectivity of the world. Indeed, in Molyneux presentation, in the problem of Molyneux, Locke is seeing a proof that to reach objectivity, that is common sensibles, we have to make something. There are a lot of reflection in Locke terminology to arrive to understand what is objective, moving from building on what is subjective, that is secondary qualities. That is, primary qualities are primary from an objective point of view, but Locke is perfectly aware that secondary quality are first for us, like Aristotle have told 2000 years before him. And so Molyneux, the answer to Molyneux question is a very important discrimination about the objectivity of common sensibles, the subjectivity of special senses, and how we arrive to common sensibles, that is to modern physics, modern science in the essence. This at stake here is a very, very big point. It is not strange. It is not strange that Leibniz have a position quite different from the Locke position. That is, in Leibniz, when Locke is speaking about primary and secondary qualities, Leibniz speak, that is Teofilo, Filarete is Locke and Teofilo is Leibniz, in the comment to the essays in the voice essay on L'Entendement Humain. Here, Teophilos, that is the speaker for Leibniz, speak about clear and confused ideas, not about primary and secondary quality. That is, here perception is much less important. Here in Leibniz, we are coming back, we are going back to Galileo point of view in a certain sense. And it is not a case that Leibniz says, yes, the recovered blind will be able to distinguish which is a cube and which is a globe. It is sufficient that we say to him, this is a very important point from an epistemological point of view, that he is seeing at a cube and a globe. Not which one is a globe and which one is a cube, but we must know that in front of him there are a cube and a globe. That is a very different situation from the original one of Molyneux and Locke. And here you see that all rationalistic approach take advantage of Molyneux position, of Molyneux problem. So it is clear that here at stake there is a very big question, and you understand why so many people are interested in this point in the history of philosophy. Okay, this is my point, and I would like to understand, to know what Brian and Gabriele think about this part. The second part I have almost finished. The second part I have already anticipated. The second part of my presentation, reading with attention all papers or beautiful papers of this book, I found that there are a lot of different QM question, QM, not because the Q is question. Molyneux, there is a lot of Molyneux questions. The standard one is the original one. Is the recovered blind able to distinguish the globe and the cube without touching them? Here, the only condition is without touching them. And it is very, very simple, very naive situation. Probably we have an answer from an experimental view. I think that held experiment give a negative answer to this very gross, very generic perspective on Molyneux problem. But we have a lot of different Molyneux questions. For instance, we have Leibniz questions. That is, Leibniz questions go in the directions that already Gabriele emphasized. That is, that people must be able to see. That is, he must learn to see. To see is not something that we begin to do immediately after acquiring the sight. It is a long process. So Leibniz emphasized the importance that we say to people that they are, to the recovered blind, that they are in front of a cube and a globe. There is another question that many scholars in the book raise. I called it an activist Molyneux question. The recovered blind able to distinguish the globe and the cube without touching them, but having the possibility to move around them. That is, we give the time to people to go around and see better and better the two forms on the table. It is a very different question with respect to the standard one, and we don't know exactly which will be the answer. Also, Benz-Nanay Molyneux question is a very interesting one, because Nanay emphasized how there are people with a strong mental imagery and people with a less strong weak mental imagery, and also between blind people there is this difference, and he wondered if this kind of capacity, mental imagery, would be relevant in the capacity of a recovered blind to distinguish, to individuate the globe and the cube? This is another very important, very interesting question about Molyneux. There is a Ferretti, very important Molyneux question. Are there differences between ventral and dorsal blindness in the Molyneux? Here there are two questions, Molyneux question. That is, Gabriele also emphasized another important difference, because not all blindness are the same. There are a lot of different kind of blindness. So each one of these deserve an individual investigation. Then there is the so-called idealistic Molyneux question. Is the recovered blind able to distinguish the globe and the cube without touching them? If he has the possibility to see in a more complete intentional form? A couple of papers in the book pose this question. Seeing in the intentional form, there is a difference between to see as a success verb and see as a verb that could be successful, but it could also fail. This is a very important difference from a linguistic point of view. And also there is an ideal seeing, that is a completing seeing, that is a visual apparatus completely developed, and on the contrary, a visual apparatus that is at the beginning of the history of his capacity to see. And there is also Celli Molyneux question. Is the correct blind able to distinguish is a neurochannel from sight neurons, neurozone, and touch neurons is not yet developed? We know here there is a lot of big problems, because at birth, people, the connection between the visual cortex and the cortex, the somatosensory cortex, are not so strong like at 30 or 40 years. So here we have another kind of problems. At which age, at which stage of development we pose the question, the Molyneux question, for a child of 1 month, or for a child of 2 years, or for a man or a woman of 30 or 40 years, is a different situation, because we know that the development of our nervous system is very important, is very plastic and very meaningful. Here there is a very interesting point posed by Glenn. This was one, in my opinion, this is the most interesting question. I thought about this question for all my life. I called it magnetic field Molyneux question. Is proposed by Brian. This point: a person acquires the non-human capacity of perceiving magnetic fields, like the Earth's magnetic field, would be able to understand what he is perceiving. This is a very interesting point. If in a future there will be a mutation and we will be able to perceive magnetic fields, which kind of perception, which kind of content will arrive to us? Is it possible that this content will be so different from what we are perceiving now, that we will have the possibility to understand that there are new perceptions of something that is completely new, that till now we are not able to perceive, or our perception is always the same, and in the content simply it will modified in the form without new kind of perception. This is a very interesting point for me. I think it is not so easy to answer to this point, but it seems to me one of the more interesting point of Molyneux type in the book. So my feeling is that there are a lot of Molyneux questions, different, and it is a very important contribution of the book. Experimental data perhaps provide a negative answer only to the standard Molyneux question. Therefore, there are many other open questions, which this book give a lot of stimulating suggestions, and so our investigation go on. The Molyneux problem will give us to think and to and to make philosophy together for a long time from now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Enzo, for this great contribution. I think now the curators may step in and answer suggestions and comments. I don't know which one is going to go first. You decide.
Okay, so I think the best way is that Brian just starts with answering the historical part, and then I can say something, and then I go for the more empirical part there. Yeah.
Fine. Okay.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll go in reverse order. I'll start with the Locke question presented by Fano. So, wow, I mean, there's like 20 papers trying to understand Locke's answer on Molyneux, right? And I think maybe 2 reflect on the primary quality, secondary quality distinction, but they don't go into the historical literature of Galileo, versus Aristotle, et cetera, very well. So I think this is very promising. I've been working on a paper on Locke's view of solidity, which actually fits your discussion well. As he says, solidity is acquired by experiencing hard things, right? Secondary qualities. So take, for instance, a football filled with air. You can know that the air is solid because when you try to compress the ball, you cannot do it, right? You feel the hardness of the air through its containment of the ball. And from that comes, boing, the idea of solidity somehow. So I have been trying to understand that with respect to how that would relate to Molyneux's question, but I've actually not gotten very far. So I think this is to focus on the primary quality, secondary quality distinction, I think is the way to connect those 2 dots. And I'm just going to do it. And I really appreciate the suggestion. That really helps me out a lot. And I'll send you an email if that's okay. Actually, I'll let Gabriele talk about the many Molyneux questions.
Yeah.
Do you want to do that now, Gabriele?
Yeah, why not?
And then go for it. Let's switch back and forth a little.
Thanks. So thanks, Enzo, for for your points. Indeed, I think this also offers an answer to Silvia. Great analysis of the second part of the book, because of course, this is an old, say, philosophical question, but then old question, similar problems, one might say, but I think the crucial point here is that as our knowledge of the visual system is increasing, then even if the answer happens to be the same, or the experimental situation seems to be the same, we have more and more technical reasons to propose the same arguments, even if they are in principle very similar, because of course there can be so many reasons for which you go for a no instead of a yes. And in case you just go for a no answer, of course there can be any reason, different reasons for endorsing one claim or the other. But I think that the interesting point is also that Molyneux's question works like a starting point for us to better understand what we really know about the visual system and what we really know about its functioning. And the more you get experimental results from neuroscience, the more you understand that these are not sufficient if you do not have a theory of vision. Because after all, if you cannot rely on a specific definition of vision, you cannot explain these experimental results. So I think the multi-layered aspect of Molyneux's question tells precisely this. This is not just a question. This is an ensemble of questions with conceptual problems, with theoretical problems. Think about how the experimental practice is, a philosopher of science might say, like theory-laden. So once you get in the lab, you already have a specific notion, or even just like a theoretical stance of what vision is. And this is very clear in some chapters, for example, the one by Broger, the one by Gallagher, and the one by Matten and Cohen, right? But I think it's really important to have in mind what's the goal. The goal is not just to have a final answer, especially in philosophy. The goal is to understand if the question is reliable and what we can do in order to make it more reliable in the light of what we know from philosophy of vision and from neuroscience of vision. And I think this is as scientific enterprise, this is the best thing we can do now. And of course, the story of Molyneux's question goes ahead as our knowledge goes ahead, as our knowledge of the visual system goes ahead. And plus, this is very interesting because especially in the last 20 or 30 years, we are going we're entering a new field. We were discussing with Brian this thing actually for a new epistemological investigation, which is an epistemology of blindness. Because blindness is a peculiar mental state, which is of course a negative one, a negative meaning that it's not an optimist perspective, it's negative in the sense that you lack something in a sense modality, but then, for example, thanks to plasticity and to other processing occurring in your neural cells, you can just learn how to use, for example, your visual cortex or your auditory cortex. And I think this is really interesting, aside from the question, the original philosophical question per se. And just one thing, super quick thing, the point of movement. I think Brian and me were like, hitting our head, on the wall, just understanding whether you can use movement or not. Because if you buy recent theories of vision, according to which vision, I don't know if causally or constitutively, but it depends on action to some extent. So it seems that you really need to explain what's the amount of the motoric processing related to vision, as for example to movement, in order to change the Gestalt properties in your visual experience. And so the question is whether you can allow for the subject to move or not. And this is a completely new question, and it begs completely new experiments, right?
Yeah. So actually, that's a great way to talk about Sylvia's discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So Lemaitre in I think 1745, I think that was when his work was. Maybe it might have been 1725. Sorry. He suggests that the Molyneux subject be able to walk around the shapes. So I think she's right. We haven't made the kind of conceptual progress that you would think, given that this is Schwenkler's big, objection to Held, right? Which kind of re-energizes the whole discussion about cataract experiments. But if we had just, read some French philosopher, we would have already known that this seems to be a requisite feature. So Sylvia is very on target with a lot of your claims. I want to try to defend the specific ones you wage against the papers in the book, which I really want. I have a lot of gratitude because I felt the tension that you called out. So, for instance, I do think this is talking about Molyneux's question is an opportunity to be inclusive of voices that you don't hear, global philosophers, women philosophers, and philosophers with disabilities. But for whatever reason, very few of them talked about Molyneux's question. So the solution, and I suppose it was a lazy solution, is to engage in kind of counterfactual reasoning. So what would Amo think about Molyneux's question had he written about it? I mean, I want to suggest he probably thought about it. It probably entered his mind. He just didn't publish on it. And like you've probably thought of significantly more things than you've ever published on, right? So all we have, of course, are his published works, including letters, that we can then kind of try to counterfactually reason what exactly would they have answered had they published on the question. That's kind of the added move I would make in response to you, Sylvia, that I do think they thought about it, even though they didn't publish on it. And so we can, in some sense, reflect and garner from their publications what they would have thought. And this allows us to include Ammo and Masham, and some philosophers of antiquity. I would have loved to have a paper on Modi and his question, but I couldn't get anybody to write on it for me. But that's an open possibility. If anybody focuses on Modi's work, his theory of perception, I think that's an incredible kind of new counterfactual way to kind of engage in Molyneux's question. Now, I don't think then, right, that the selection of authors to include is arbitrary. We will include the authors that are marginalized, right? So that's one reason why Hegel wouldn't be included, et cetera, in this kind of counterfactual historiography. I did want to also answer about Degenar's contribution. I love that you enjoyed it with the students' answers and how they, in some sense, demonstrate that philosophers, these big time thinkers, don't really have like ideas that a child couldn't come up with themselves. And it makes philosophy even more inclusive than it otherwise would, because it means individuals with fertile intuitions can engage in philosophy at the level, maybe not the level of specificity, but the level of interest and engagement that these high profile philosophers can engage in. And I think this is why I put it in the history section, because essentially what Degenar is trying to do is to say, look, these big time philosophers that we study as historians, though they engage in the specificity much better than these kids, it's not like they have a more active and fertile intellect, right? So I think it's a comment on the history. So I don't know if that does justice to the placement of her essay, but I liked it. Now Diderot. So he's the common target in disability studies as being somebody who's ocularist and does not respect people with blindness at the level that their respect is due. So, for instance, Saunderson is treated, you say he's very sympathetic of Saunderson, but at the same time, he's also the subject of study, what might be called the object of study. Saunderson is in many ways not unlike an experimental subject, a rat, a guinea pig, and what have you. And Diderot's kind of reflections on Saunderson are like the lab scientist to the experimental animal, as it were. And I think that kind of invokes a hierarchical bias, where Diderot's words on Saunderson are authoritative, but not Saunderson's words themselves. That's where the worry of Diderot's kind of ocularism works its way in. Now, of course, Diderot does say some pretty astounding things. Essentially, Saunderson probably couldn't be a Christian, couldn't believe in a God because he can't see the wonders of the world. But that's just to say that sight is the only basis upon which we can experience the wonders of the world. That's paradigmatically ocularist, right? And that's, again, a statement that Diderot makes. Okay, but your side of the story is also accurate, right? Diderot is sympathetic. I agree with Sandra. I agree with your claims there. And in many ways, he brings a subject of fear, right? Being blind, to the general populace as something that shouldn't be feared, right? That should be praised, that should be considered on its own merit. So I kind of feel I see the tension, and I accept your criticism of Diderot. But at the same time, if you're a person with blindness and you read Diderot, you're astonished, right? So, I mean, something you didn't quote, but essentially Diderot makes this claim that a person with blindness would lack morality because they can't distinguish the sound of urinating and blood trickling from a stabbed body. And in that sense, they can't feel the full gravity of a murder, as it were. That essentially is placing people with blindness on this amoral, animalistic status. And that's concerning. I mean, just that statement alone. And so if you're a person with blindness and you read something like that, that's fundamentally wrong and immoral to make a claim like that. And I think that's the basis of Cleage and Hayhoe's concern with what Diderot wrote. Not to say that they just slammed the book down and discontinued reading, but they did pick and choose, the most astonishing claims that Diderot made, and made light of them when maybe they should have been more considerate of the full picture that you painted of Diderot, which I think is more accurate in the end. Anyway, very generous comments, both of you. I really appreciate them. Gabriele, you might have something more to say, but
no, just one super quick follow up about counterfactual thinking. I mean, this is not just about the history of philosophy and Molyneux, but also on the neuroscientific part. Because think about it, most of the time you can test your patients, even in the case of blindness, but sometimes what you do is just the following: you write a paper on theoretical neuroscience in which you say, well, this is the thing we want to understand, and this is our current knowledge of vision. So in the case of Molyneux, you can say just, well, if this is the question, and if this is the way we can test it, and if this is the current story about the real functioning of our visual system, then this is the answer we might cash out if testing. And the fact that we cannot test should not just limit us about wondering what an answer could be, even because just reasoning about possible experimental tests or reasoning about the possible conceptual problems about testing experimentally could give us a clue of the problems we have in our theory of vision and blindness, not just on Molyneux' question. And I think this is crucial because it's of course a general development of vision science and also of philosophy of vision science. So yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Gabriele and Brian. Now, first of all, I apologize. I don't know why my camera went out, so you can't see me, I guess. And secondly, I realized that time is kind of late and some people had to leave already. But I think we have time until 5:30 if there are questions from the floor or perhaps even replies from the discussants. And should anybody from the floor want to ask a question in Italian, we can also translate it. Quindi se ci sono domande in italiano anche sono accettabili.
So what's the way of raising the hand? Just like this, or we Google?
There is a raising hand in the yes, below on the screen.
Yeah,
or
sure.
You can just switch on your microphone and step in.
Come on, we need objections. Come on.
O domande? Non sarà tutto chiaro?
Yeah.
Since no one is saying anything, I make a very, very simple observation, but I think that all of us agree about this point. We know that we have this big problem of the underrepresented people in philosophy of science. And so many congress are dedicated are open to this kind of people that is underrepresented in philosophy of science. My point is the following, but I think that we all of us agree. But I think it is useful to emphasize this point. We know from experimental psychology that in a pool of people that come from very different perspective, from very different situation, both physical and psychological, the result of the investigation is better. It is more idea come out, a more complete presentation of the different questions at stake and so on. That is in a team with a lot of different point of view, investigation, and also this decision about also in the direction of a commercial enterprise or a school or any kind of institution. It is better to have a different point of view. And this point is a question concerning the discovery. That is a context of discovery from a philosophical point of view. I have big doubt, but I don't know what you think about that. Underrepresented people could add something from the context of justifications. That is, in the moment that, for instance, speaking about Molyneux question, in the moment that we ask to think about Molyneux question to a blind guy, it is clear that it is possible that he is able to understand that seeing people is cannot directly think about. But I think that if the hypothesis, the analysis of a blind guy is different and new with respect to what can see a seeing guy, after the blind guy discovered this new point, this became something that is common to all people. That is, it is something that now all people can see. Or you think that it is possible that also justification is different in different kind of people, like blind people, underrepresented, all kind of underrepresented African people, East Asian people, and so on. That is, my feeling is that this problem of underrepresentation is above all about the context of discovery and not the context of justification. I don't know what you think about Gabriele and Brian on this point.
That's a good question. I really, to be honest, I should think about that more, because I don't get a personal answer now. But thanks. Tough question, yeah. Brian, do you have something in mind now?
Yeah, so, I mean, let's take Pierre Villy, the blind philosopher, Montaigne scholar, who reasoned about Molyneux's question by inverting the senses. Does that add to the answers to Molyneux's question, or does that add to kind of the way in which we discover an answer?
Yes.
Yeah. I think okay. So I mean, we can, you know, I'm a pluralist, so both. That's the way I would go about it. But you know, I think in the end, Vili's answer is there is no answer. It's a no answer to Molyneux. In other words, because it's so ocularist, even if you invert it, you're just being anti-ocularist. So we just need to dismiss the question altogether, you know. And I just wonder, you know, if I say that, if I make that claim, yeah, Vili's just a no answer type guy, then that just only leads to, I think, the discovery of a new way of answering Molyneux's question, the no answer. And so in that sense, I mean, I would lean more towards the discovery rather than just like accepting and adopting. Oh, okay, well, you know, tick one up for the inverted no answer to Molyneux's question. I don't know if that really gets at your point, but I see the point that you're making, and it's really it's really nice to think about it. Like, thank you very much. I think Vili's a nice example.
Yes, I had a friend of mine. I am a hyposighting. I have big problems of sight in general, and I have a friend of mine that is completely blind and a philosopher, and we discussed a lot about perception, Molyneux problem, blind sight, many other questions. But it is clear that discussing with Giancarlo was very interesting because he has a completely different point of view. But on the rationality of argument, we agree completely. It was not a difference of the arguments, but difference in the sense that he can see something that I cannot directly see. So in the context of discovery, it is very, very, very rich. But at the end of the day, we agree completely about the conclusion. But it's a very small experience.
But I guess that's the same with like philosophy of skills. You have philosophers, you know, doing philosophy of sport or philosophy of motor action, which are not very good in sport. And then
yes.
very good in sport, which do not care at all about sport philosophy. So it depends.
It's beautiful movie also. What all women know.
Yeah.
About, I don't remember the protagonist. He wrote a very beautiful book on fishing, but he never fished.
Okay, so no, any question from the attendants, from the floor?
Maybe I have one.
Yes,
Hi.
thank you.
Yeah, like more than a question, maybe I've had some ideas while listening to you.
Please.
Like one is that I was thinking about synesthesia, about the experience of like two senses that like merge together in some cases. And also I was thinking about multimodal areas, like in the brain, where more senses are like processed, and there is a sort of more idealized content that is like there. And in that sense, maybe there is like a sort of geometry that binds, especially, I would say, these two senses, like the sight and the touch. But yeah, these are only like two ideas that pop up in my mind. Yeah.
I know, Brian, you want to say something, but I want to say something as well. So you start and then I go?
So there is no paper on Molyneux's question in synesthesia, and someone should write one. Jump now your turn.
No, great. So, but I think that think about the chapter by Cheng on somatosensory spaces. I mean, of course, Molyneux's question is also very informative, I think, and also beneficial for the literature, for the research field on multimodality. And this is very interesting for two empirical reasons, or more neuroscientific reasons. One is, so there's a debate in philosophy of neuroscience, hardcore philosophy of neuroscience, about what's the relation between cortical states and mental states. So of course this is like an orthogonal, answer, but still it's very interesting when you come to plasticity to understand the extent to which you can have the phenomenon called pluripotency, just one cortical area, different mental states, or degeneracy, that is different cortical states and one mental state, or maybe it was the other way around, but I don't care. Marco Viola is not listening now. So I think it's a very good question, because on the basis of the theory you have about like pluripotency, that is one area, numerous mental states, and degeneracy, that is more areas, and blah blah blah. You can investigate the multimodality, the multimodal aspect of Molyneux's question. And I think this is very good, and it of course relates to the question on perceptual experience in synesthesia. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks to you.
One last question, perhaps. Silvia, any more comments? Well, I guess that we had a wonderful discussion, and so it may be time to end it, to round it up. Thank you very, very much again for this debate to Brian Glenney, Gabriele Ferretti, Vincenzo Fano, and Silvia Parigi. Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon to the Italian floor and Italian speakers, and good morning or whatever to Brian. Bye-bye. See you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye to everyone.